And you've mentioned that, you're greatly influenced by literature in general, and I've read many of your interviews stating that. So I'm really interested to hear, your thoughts and your preferences, and maybe, specific authors or books that made big difference in your life, something that, really developed your personality to the way that you perceive and create art.
I think the biggest is French, probably followed up by Russian in terms of de Beauvoir, Camus, Sartre, but also over to Nabokov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. I would say those are definitely very informative. My mother always read a lot as a kid, and my early favorites were like Edgar Allan Poe and Oscar Wilde, and eventually that turned into more like thriller stuff like Stephen King. And I don't know, I've always just been very, very driven to read. I'm happy to, I tend to read more when I'm here overseas, and I've just been going through book after book, which I just really love. I want my home to resemble that of a library someday. So it's always been extremely informative for me. I remember I once saw an interview with Tim. I think it was Tim from Rise Against, and he mentioned how he keeps a bookmark in his book, and as he reads, he'll jot down lyric ideas. And I find that I would never be able to write anything again if I wasn't consuming, fiction myself. So that's always just been so big for me. I never at all anticipated being a musician as a sort of career, which this has turned into somehow now over the last 17 years. But if it wasn't that, I was certainly pursuing English literature, and it's certainly a very huge staple and sort of fundamental element to just me as a human being.
This is such a satisfying answer for me, because through knowing your lyrics and knowing your art, I've always felt that you're a big fan of existentialism, and you've mentioned names that are very striking to me in terms of Camus and Sartre. And these writers are, names that greatly impacted my personal life and the way I perceive everything around me. So it's very interesting to hear that this is the same to you. And I'm just interested to hear what's your favorite Camus book? I'm very interested to hear that. And I'm also curious to hear, do you remember the first time that you read something in this area of philosophy? And do you remember how impacted you, or what made you think?
Sorry, I was just trying to go back and think of some Camus I enjoyed.
Sure. The Stranger is a big one, obviously. The Plaque, Sisyphus.
Myth of Sisyphus was a big one.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to think of my first one. I know that Nausea I generally proclaim as my favorite novel of all time, being Sartre. So I always usually like to stick to that one. Honestly, I've gone more to de Beauvoir in recent years, and I remember I read one about her and a childhood best friend. I think that was earlier this year, last year. But The Mandarins was always a big one for me. She wrote a book about Sartre's death, I recall, that I really liked. But honestly, it's been years since I got into some Camus.
Or maybe, it might not be just his specific book, but maybe a book in this field that you remember that you read and just, created a big wave in your mind in terms of philosophy and, existence and all of these terms that are relevant to this field,
Certainly. I think, more than anything, I would probably say Anton Chekhov.
Yeah.
I think that was around 2011 I was dating a girl who recommended Chekhov, and I think that started for a lot of it. But I remember Dostoevsky early on. Our former bass player, Andy, Brothers Karamazov is his favorite novel of all time. And he bought that for me one Christmas, and I've read it a few times now. So I think I probably, at least to my memory, probably started with Russian before I started reading English, or before I started reading French translations. But anymore, I mean, lately, Peter Handke, quite brilliant. I've been obsessed with him this year. Contemporary, like anything Karl Ove Knausgaard has done, a Norwegian writer who wrote a series called My Struggle, has been deeply, deeply inspirational for me. So those are some off the top of my head in terms of the early ones to some of the more recent ones.
Nice. I was just actually going to ask you what you're reading right now, but I guess you answered this question.
Right now I'm reading Sing Backwards and Weep, which is a memoir by the late musician Mark Lanigan. So I like to mix up fiction with nonfiction, and I oftentimes will read musicians' memoirs that, even if the artist has no relevance or interest to me, I'm always fascinated by musicians' stories and hearing how things used to be and whatnot, and just the wild stories, addiction and such. I started that yesterday, and I'm well halfway through. Mark Lanigan, this memoirs just blew the doors off me. I finished a book called Lungfish yesterday by is a debut novel by an American writer named Megan Gillis. I thought it was brilliant. I really loved it. And before that, I read the new Nick Cave conversation book with I think his name is Sean O'Hagan, called Faith, Hope, and Carnage. Nice. Nick Cave means everything to me musically, and in all facets. I actually pre-ordered 2 copies of that book on accident. When it was released. I had 2 different copies shipped to my house because I guess at one point I pre-ordered it and then forgot. But it was also very enjoyable. I'll certainly reread that again in the coming years.
Nice. I'll have just one book question because, I'm always so much enjoying just discussing this topic with like-minded individuals, because for me, this doesn't happen very often, unfortunately. You mentioned Stephen King as well, but do you have a favorite biographical book for a musician? Something that really strikes you as well?
Harry Brownstein's actually really spoke to me. Surprisingly, it struck me more than the Kim Gordon memoir or biography. I don't know. And I've never been interested in Sleater Kenny. But I remember that one really knocked the wheels off for me. I would love to revisit that one. I've read a number of Ian Curtis biographies and whatnot, following Joy Division, of course. Other Sonic Youth books following, their past. But Warren Ellis released Nina Simone's Gum. I think that was last year, which was really terrific. It was everything I was hoping it would be. But honestly, this Mark Lanigan book is just it's insane. It's wonderful. I'll likely have it finished by tomorrow, I think, by end of day tomorrow. But what's another one?
Nikki Sixx, maybe. The Heroine.
I haven't read that.
Really?
Is it good?
You definitely should try it out. Yeah.
Okay.
I think you would enjoy it a lot. It's very, very real and very crazy as well.
I'm sure. Actually, another one that I have in my backpack I haven't read yet is, I guess it's more collective stories and poems, but I didn't know that Leonard Cohen had published a few different works. So I really look forward to getting into that one. I don't know what it's called, but again, I think it's like a short novel or poems and just a collection of writings by Leonard Cohen. So I'll be getting into that in the next week or two as well.
Amazing. Is there a moment where it feels interesting for you to read such stories, considering that you maybe feel related somehow with the musician's wife, considering that this is your career as well? Or do you enjoy it more as like experience this as a spectator? I'm very interesting to hear this, aspect of perceiving such information.
I think it's certainly more a spectator. I mean, I've never done drugs. I've never slept around by any means when I'm on tour. I would consider myself not at all rock and roll by most means. But there's something so deeply intriguing about rock and roll that I definitely love. Like, I always consider myself more of a music consumer than a music maker. So hearing these stories is just it is definitive rock and roll, and I find that deeply intriguing. And I just thought of an American writer, Rob Roberge. He has I guess you would call it a memoir called Liar, and I need to rewrite that one. That was another one that was, it's astonishing. It's brilliant. It's sad. It's moving. I like slow pace, evocative, moody. I'm not much of a upbeat individual, especially when it comes to my choice of fiction.
Yeah, I completely can relate to that, honestly. Do you write, obviously a part of, lyrics and everything that is related to the band, do you write in other forms, in other fields?
Yeah, I've written a few books that I've just self-published, but my recent one is called Bullet Made Tambourine, which is sort of choppy prose. I kind of refer to it as like the poor man's William Burroughs.
That's a nice one.
Without heroin, of course, and drugs. So the one before that, Three Dots in the Guilt Machine, also a collection of choppy prose and poetry. And I'm working on a few different ones now. I've started a few novels that I've never completed, and maybe at the end of this year or early next year, I'll actually wrap them up. But I read much more than I write, as I believe is, you should listen to more music than make. I think you should read more than you write, but an active exercise for me, for sure.